It all starts with a vision, the foresight to see the possibilities ahead, and the brilliant ingenuity to bring it to life, and the skill to make the impossible possible. It is understanding your role and using it to shape the way forward. It is to recognize the freedom of creativity. It's having the ability to be bold, yet stay relevant through the years by creating forms that are meaningful and lasting. Built to beautify your life, built for you to thrive. It is this spirit of perfection and wanting better that fuels our purpose at Nations Trust Bank. A philosophy that drives us to be more than a bank and recognize our ability to shape life's present and future by building relationships that endure. Shaped the right way, shaped for better. Nations Trust Bank. Trust in better.
Good evening to all of you. Yeah, so Dr. Matt, I'd like to introduce him formally, and I'd like to take a couple of minutes of your time to talk about him personally, from some of the on the areas that he's been working on with us closely. Dr. Matt van der Clift, CSIRO Australia, Commonwealth Scientific Industrial and Research Organization, Environment and Director of the IRA Blue Carbon Hub. His research seeks to enhance our understanding of blue carbon ecosystems and improve frameworks in which they are managed. He's publicized on the science of blue carbon and the relevance of international governance and finance frameworks to operationalize blue carbon into climate mitigation and adaptation. That's what you're probably going to hear a lot about this evening for the last 30 years. So amazing decades, 3 decades of research. His experience spans understanding the factors which control plant growth and the responses to the way humans use them in the Indian Ocean in particular, as well as in the Mediterranean and Caribbean seas. So that's the formal piece. But what I'd like to thank Dr. Matt for all the mentorship and all the inputs that he's been giving us over the years, particularly on our flagship project in Alavinadawa, the Mangrove project, the Accelerated Natural Mangrove Project, which, in case you didn't know, was a part of the UN flagship effort, and part of which Sri Lanka won earlier this year. So it's certainly a flagship project now, already flagged internationally. Dr. Matt has been a mentor to all scientists and for all scientific work for the project over the years, and also has been instrumental in, through CSIRO, giving us hardware for various aspects of the project, and one being a state-of-art weather station, which is something that was absolutely essential and something we really couldn't have done without and could have got from nowhere else. So thank you, Dr. Matt. A couple of things on the research. I've been working with him over the last 3 to 4 days. The team has been working with him. I had the privilege of working with him today. And I mean, his commitment to research, his commitment to see youngsters move forward, where he says, you know, we've certainly got an abundance of talent here. I see him bringing out amazing work, and he is very optimistic about the talent that we have in this country, Dr. Matt. And he's also looking at seeing how he can get some of these students and these youngsters out there into the international scene. So he's lots of plans for us and for our young researchers. Dr. Matt is also looking at bringing Sri Lanka into the whole blue carbon ecosystem, trying to make Sri Lanka an epicenter for blue carbon, for talks and for blue carbon work sometime in 2025. And I'm sure that's going to be a very significant milestone for our country's environmental trajectory. So, yeah, thank you, Dr. Matt, for all you're doing for Sri Lanka, for all you're doing for the WNPS and the scientific community. Welcome, and looking forward to the amazing stuff you're going to share with us over the next 1 hour. Thank you.
Wow, thank you, Graham. I recognise the 3 decades of research. I don't think I recognise the rest of the introduction. I'm very honoured and very privileged, and thank you, Graham and Spencer and the WPS team for giving me the opportunity to talk to you about some of my work, to talk to you about some of the things I've been thinking about. And I had the opportunity to visit the WNPS office this morning, and I can vouch for the statement that I feel optimistic about the talent that's coming through in Sri Lanka. You have some amazing young scientists coming through the system, and giving them opportunity, I'm sure we will see them grow. Now, I was given strict instructions not to give you a dry science talk, but to make it a little bit lively. So let's see if I can fit the bill. I'll try and cover a little bit of ground and talk to you about, well, I'll try and fill my brief and talk to you about the market aspect, but I'll also try and cover a bit more ground, and we'll see if I run out of time and Graham starts waving at me and I have to stop. I'm always happy to answer questions afterwards. So I want to talk about how to build a regenerative economy, a regenerative blue economy, and how we might begin to do that. But in order to do that, we have to frame the current context. We do have globally, not just Sri Lanka, but in Australia, where I'm from, and globally, we have a few problems that we're trying to address. First and foremost, perhaps, is the problem of climate change. Now, climate change, I don't think is news to anyone in this room, but I guess reflecting on what climate change means. Now, certainly in Australia, where I'm from, sometimes people think climate change is polar bears and ice caps and coral reefs. Well, climate change is people. And climate change is a story of people and how they're affected, and a story of, we can move the mics a little closer. How's that? I'll try and talk closer to the mic. How's that? All right. So climate change being a story of people, and climate change being a story of extremes as well. Sometimes we think climate change is a story of global temperatures inching upwards. Well, yes, that's happening on average, but that's not the main problem that we're facing. The main problem that we're facing is the extremes in storms, the extremes in heat waves. Heat waves are a large cause of mortality across the world now. And climate change, as you might know, is caused by emissions of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. One of the main ones, not the only one, but by volume, the main one is carbon dioxide. This movie, it's a movie that's based on a model of real observations. This movie gives you a sense of a few things. I mean, what's the obvious pattern here? The obvious pattern is a north versus south pattern, but there's also a pattern that's of distribution. So when carbon dioxide is emitted from one place, it moves around, it doesn't stay there. And so the whole world is affected. Now think about the carbon dioxide part, and this is where I come in terms of my blue carbon ecosystems, and of course the carbon is the clue in this story. So I'm talking about mangroves, of which you have in Sri Lanka, seagrasses, of which you have in Sri Lanka, and tidal marshes, in which you have in Sri Lanka. Now, I promise not to put any equations in my talk, but I have one, just to demonstrate what I'm talking about. Now, how many of you did high school biology of some kind. Don't be shy, you can tell me. All right, so maybe you remember the equation for photosynthesis. Photosynthesis takes up carbon dioxide, takes in water, shakes it about with a little bit of sunlight, and produces a sugar and oxygen. That oxygen is what we breathe and what sustains us, and the sugar is what becomes the plant, right? And what's special about the blue carbon ecosystems is when parts of that plant dies and go into the sediment, they go into a wet, salty environment. Now that's the environment that we go through with our boots that's hard to walk in. And because it's wet, because it's salty, it's very low in oxygen. So oxygen doesn't move through that system, which means that things that need oxygen can't get it. And that means the decomposes, right? So as your leaf falls, goes into this mud, as things wash down rivers, it goes into the mud, it accumulates faster than these things can eat them. Okay, so there's our carbon part. All right. Now, I mentioned extremes. Now, we already have extremes. We have extremes of heat, we have extremes of weather are a particular problem. Now, they're always one. Climate change amplifies the severity of the storms such that the hurricanes, the cyclones, the typhoons are getting stronger. And also we've developed the coast so that some of the natural buffers that we use to dampen the effects of those storms have disappeared. Now, we are getting better at finding ways to protect people and protect their homes and protect where they live and work. But we can't, like early warning systems, for example, letting people know with good, accurate weather forecasts when to go and seek shelter. But we can't, without the buffer to reduce the risk, we can't get rid of it completely. And this just is a little demonstration. If you can see the map, the red colours around the Indian Ocean show that risk from extreme weather in terms of the mortality that it causes tends to be strongest around the Indian Ocean. So it tends to be strongest in the area that we live and work. All right, our third problem, food security. Now, I took this photo in Madagascar. This was a village which relies on fishing, and they have a particular seagrass meadow that's offshore, and I was there looking at the seagrass meadow, and I was there when the catch came in. And I was struck by how meagre the catch is there. The small fish, the little wrasse that the children are holding there, that's all they have. So they'll do their best with that, and they'll turn it into a soup and extract whatever nutrition they can from that. All right? And that tends to be a growing problem around the world, especially in the coastal system. So what's you know about the Sustainable Development Goals, right? Number 2 is about hunger. So poverty and hunger, 1 and 2, all right? When we are making some inroads into hunger, but it's a little bit difficult when some of the systems that sustain the food that people eat are being degraded and they're being lost. And again, this is just a demonstration that the places that we see on the earlier carbon dioxide map, the places that are emitting carbon dioxide, of course, don't have necessarily the hunger problem, and the other places often do. Where is our food coming from? Well, it depends where you are. So this is a little comparison. I wonder if you can see it. So down the bottom is my country. We're a nation of meat eaters, right? So we eat meat and dairy, so milk. But not every country is, and so many countries rely very heavily on what they can sustain themselves from the ocean. Sri Lanka just happens to be one of them. So Sri Lanka up the top there, relying on its protein from plants, and I understand why after being here for the last week, how it's cooked, it's always very delicious. But also relying very heavily on seafood, all right? So there are some countries which are more exposed to the loss of habitat which sustains their main source of protein. All right, so we want, instead of that first photo of the catches of tiny little wrasse, we want systems that produce like this, that sustain people and can feed and provide the calories, the macronutrients, and provide health. All right, problem number 4, biodiversity loss. Now, probably in a room full of people who belong to something like the Wildlife and Nature Protection Society, not only do you know about the problem of biodiversity loss, but you care about the problem. But not everybody knows and not everybody cares. And so that's why I try and work out, well, why should they care? And one of the most compelling reasons, purely from a position of self-interest, is because of more than half of global GDP relies on services that we get from nature. So if we think about the timber we get from forests, if we think about the fish that we get from oceans, if we think about the food that we get from farming and agriculture of various kinds. So we are really highly dependent on nature and all of those services that regulate it, the water, the pollination. So when we're losing some of those services through the biodiversity loss, then we're actually providing risk to our global economy and everything that we depend on. And you might have heard of the World Economic Forum. So the World Economic Forum is this group of individuals that meet in Davos in Switzerland once a year, and they talk about what are the threats to the global economy. So this is not a group of greenies and a group of tree huggers. This is a group of people who think about threats to the economy. And each year for the last, well, for as long as I've been looking at it, certainly for 5 years or longer, the number one threats have always been climate change and nature loss, because they see that those are the threats to the global economy and the threats to not only livelihoods and resources, but the threats to how some of those people are making their money. So, can the ocean offer solutions? I've talked about 4 problems: climate change, coastal risk from storms, I've talked about food security, and I've talked about biodiversity loss. So going back to my original title, which is talking about a regenerative blue economy, can we start to not only halt some of that, but can we start to reverse it and provide a system which starts to sustain us in a more sustainable way? So that's what I'm about. So I look after something called the Indian Ocean Rim Association Blue Carbon Hub. Now, IORA, the Indian Ocean Rim Association, is an intergovernmental organisation. There's 23 member states around the Indian Ocean, of which Sri Lanka is one. And you might not know that at the moment Sri Lanka is chair. So Sri Lanka is chair of IORA, which is a position of some gravitas. And so I provide a service. I operate something that within IORA is called a Centre of Excellence. I provide a service as to how to think about how we can make our way towards a blue economy which is restorative and regenerative. All right, so I've put those 4 problems up there because those are the 4 problems which frame what I do. All right, so as I mentioned, we have the 3 systems that I'm talking about. So these are the coastal systems that are on the coast. They're our lungs and they're our kidneys on the coast. And when it comes to Indian Ocean countries, we have a wealth of resources. So just looking at mangroves, so in Indian Ocean countries have around half of the world's mangroves. So that's of 23 countries of the 200 countries in the world have half of the world's mangroves, all right? But we haven't been particularly good stewards of the system because although we have half of the world's mangroves, we've been losing them at a higher rate. So we're responsible for around 2/3 of mangrove loss. So that's not great. So it's like having a wonderful asset in your home and just allowing it to degrade so that you don't get the benefit of it. I also mentioned that Sri Lanka also has these tidal marshes, or sometimes called salt marshes. Well, the same. We're losing those at proportionally greater rates. We don't have as much as the rest of the world. There's lots of marshes in North America and Europe, for example. I haven't got estimates of seagrass because seagrass, we don't know. Seagrass is underwater and we haven't figured out a way of mapping that around the world in an effective way yet. All right, so a glimmer of good news is that we know how to reverse the loss. We now have the skills, we have the techniques, we have, in some cases, we have the technologies that allow us. And these are just images of knowing how to do it and examples from around our region, mostly in Australia. So we know how to restore marsh systems. We know how to restore mangrove systems. We are getting better. Corals have been hard, but we're getting better at doing that. And now we haven't talked about our bivalve reefs. They used to be very extensive around our region, but have been largely removed for dredging. But we're finding ways of bringing them back and getting the benefits. But I want to encourage us to think beyond just returning, and this is nature protection, and we're interested in returning nature to a state that we might perceive it used to be. But in some cases, that's not going to be appropriate. So I've been looking around Colombo for the last few days, and you have a lot of concrete. You have sea walls and harbour walls and things, all right? There's opportunities to rethink the way that they're being designed so that you can actually integrate some of these regeneration into the design. So this is an example from Sydney where just by adding some structure onto a seawall, it creates habitat. That habitat then allows for the return of species that can't live on a straight wall, but it also provides for opportunities for artisanal livelihoods, because then you get the bivalves and you get the crabs and you get other things turning up that provide opportunities. And you can go further than that because you can look to aquaculture. Sometimes we turn our nose up at aquaculture because we think aquaculture is the problem, right? We think about the prawn, the shrimp ponds as being unsustainable. Well, there's opportunities to rethink that, right? We can rethink that in the ocean in terms of seaweed aquaculture or bivalve aquaculture, but we can rethink that in a prawn or shrimp farming context as well, because there are effective examples of silvo fisheries where you can grow the mangroves, and the mangroves themselves can provide resource. For example, they can provide a sustainable source of timber in some situations. And then you can still get the sustainable yield of the protein. And if we do that, it actually turns out that when we look at the numbers, it can be some of the most cost-effective of the options that we have available to us. So this is an example of the coastal protection benefit of mangroves. Now, the coastal protection benefit of mangroves is quite well understood by the insurance industry. And why would it be well understood by the insurance industry? Because they're interested in reducing their exposure to events which might mean paying out to repair damage. All right, so they've twigged on to the fact that if you restore a mangrove system, the protection benefit that it offers is actually, in monetary terms, much more than it actually costs to plant the mangroves. All right, so the benefits can be enormous. All right. So then, why aren't we doing it? All right. Well, one of the reasons why is because at the moment it hasn't become mainstreamed into the way we think about the economy and the way that we think about how we pay for things. Because at the moment, if we think about, and NBS just means these nature-based solutions, all right? If we think about nature-based solutions around the world, it's still mostly governments that pays the bill. So there is an estimate that each year around $200 billion gets spent on some kind of nature-based activity each year, of which three-quarters of that, more than three-quarters of that, comes from governments. And less than a quarter is coming from the private sector. So the private sector, and typically when we're talking about the benefits that accrue from these systems, it's usually the private sector that accrues the benefits, but the private sector haven't yet realised that they need to invest. Now, on the flyer for the talk, it talked about carbon markets, and I don't want to lure you here under false pretenses, so I am going to talk about the carbon markets. But as a proportion of global expenditure on nature repair, carbon markets in that figure is so small that you can't even see it. So of that 200 billion, there's around 1% of that is on carbon markets, all carbon markets, right? So carbon markets are still very, very small. Now, we've talked about the scale of the challenge, and some of you might know about the Global Biodiversity Framework. And that Global Biodiversity Framework, Sri Lanka has signed up to that and has obligations under that now. It has committed to spending a certain amount each year to, again, to halt the loss of biodiversity and to start to reverse the decline. Well, those amounts that I showed you before are not enough to fill the gap. So this graph, you don't have to read it really. It's just, the point of it is to show at the moment the amount that we're spending is not enough. And that is why we, despite all of the work that we do, we keep seeing decline. But there are a lot of kinds of finance that are available, all right? So yes, sometimes we think about carbon markets, and I will, trust me, I will talk about carbon markets, but there's a lot of other options that are available to us. So I mentioned the insurance sector is interested in investing in things like mangrove restoration, and one of the biggest natural insurance investments in the world is actually in Belize, and you might have heard of it. It's actually an insurance product that is about coral restoration. So I haven't talked very much about corals, but corals also provide a great coastal protection service because the structure of the corals, and if you've been to a coral reef, you've probably seen how the waves break on the corals. And so that dissipates the wave energy and allows the calmer water through. So the insurance sector is paying for that. But there's many other options available to us. There are bonds. Now, if we're talking about money, now bonds are big money. Right? Bonds are in the millions to tens of millions of US dollars. And there is interest in this concept of blue bonds, where, and bonds are attractive to an institutional investor because it tends to earn a larger return. Tends to earn a greater, someone solid, it's guaranteed by a government. I will. Now markets, I told you before, markets are a tiny proportion. Why do we talk so much about them? I think it's because we understand them, right? We intuitively, we understand works because we can go to a market and we can exchange it in the market and we can buy our fish, right? So we pay our money and we get that, all right? Now, there are layers of complication in the carbon market because unlike when we go to the fish market, when we buy fish, we don't need that fish to be independently accredited as a certified fish. We know it's a fish, but we do need that in a carbon market world. And I'll get to some of the science. If there's time, I'll get to some of the science of how we do that at the end. So there's a couple of layers of complexity, but otherwise we can stick with a relatively simple concept of an exchange between a buyer and a seller, right? And we have a national carbon market in Australia, and I'll give you one example of what that looks like. So I've been Graham mentioned Unravelling, which I've been to with the team. Late last week. So I see in Sri Lanka you have these ponds, aquaculture ponds and sultans, and they're an opportunity to bring back nature. We don't have that so much in Australia, but what we do have are places where the tide has been blocked to allow agriculture to happen. So this is an example in Queensland, and all it is a wall that's been put to stop this tide. So all they're trying to do is stop the salt water from going up the estuary. And by stopping the salt water going up the estuary, they're able to grow crops like sugar cane, which has been very productive, or just simply grow the kind of pastures that the cows and the sheep need. And when you remove that wall, then the salt water returns. The sugar cane and the pastures, of course, they all have to go. But what comes in its place is the mangroves. And remember, right at the beginning, I talked about how these mangrove and seagrass systems have a particular environment that encourages the accumulation of carbon. So that's what happens. And so this is the first registered blue carbon project in Australia. It's in Queensland, and the estimate is that will generate around 41,000 tonnes of carbon dioxide sequestered over 25 years. It's a conservative estimate. And as well as doing that, we've done some surveys. You get all these other benefits that come in as well. So, for example, these bats are starting to come, birds are starting to come, and the bats have particular services. So the bats, of course, these are insectivorous bats that are coming back into the mangroves. And they're a particular form of bat that's able to fly around in a forest. So you imagine mangroves are quite a dense system, right? So these bats have navigational capacity to be able to move around inside that forest, and they're voracious insect eaters. So they're able to provide a service in controlling some of those pests as well. Now, there is a catch in this particular situation, because it might seem this is great, we remove the tide, we allow this to come in 41,000 tonnes of CO2 at a current Australian price of around about $30 a tonne. So we're going to get some millions of dollars of return on that investment, all right? But in order to do this, it's cost $5 million so far. So we're getting a return of somewhere in the $1.5 to $2 million return on that investment of $5 million, right? So it doesn't always break down quite the way we want. Now, this So what you might be able to see, these are just dots on a map, and the one that I've been talking about there is the one dot on the map of Australia that you can see. All right, so that's the one we have. But all through the equatorial regions of the globe, there are efforts to try and make this happen. All right, these are all blue carbon projects, so most of them are mangroves. Not all of them. There's a couple of marsh projects as well. There's not very many seagrass projects, and the reason for that is because we're a bit slower at restoring seagrass. Mostly they're mangroves. And there's a couple of things that you could pull out of this particular plot, but maybe one of the main things is that in contrast to where that movie of the carbon dioxide emissions, it's kind of the opposite, right? So all of these are happening in the equatorial, sometimes called the global south regions. All right, so far so good. But not everybody agrees. And so it's time to maybe take my scientist hat off for a moment and think about moral philosophy, about why do we want to do this? So there are opponents to doing this, because those opponents say we are taking nature and all its glory and we are turning it into units that then we're trying to sell. And sometimes that might not work. And in some circumstances, it might work. So there's a philosopher called Michael Sandel at Harvard University, and he doesn't talk so very much about carbon markets, but what he talks about is what is money for and how can we use it. So there's an element of thinking about, if we turn the world into a carbon market, where does that take us? So history matters in this context, so it's worth thinking about that carbon markets originated in the early 1990s as a solution that was backed by Europe and America. And this was at a time when a neoliberal economic philosophy was quite the flavour. All right, so markets were really big, and finding ways to use markets to solve problems was really big. And it's really picked up since then. But not everybody agrees, because there's a sense that in turning nature into units and in trading those units, that we might somehow be changing the essence of what nature is. So imagine if I gave to you the example of, can you buy a friend? I mean, the answer is no. I mean, you can pay somebody to be with you if you've got the money and the inclination, but that person, if they're doing it for money, it's not your friend, all right? So the act of the financial transaction changes the nature of what it is, all right? Whereas it's different from if I go to the market and I buy a fish. That's a straightforward transaction. The nature of the fish doesn't change. All right, so there's some thought involved. Now, one of my colleagues counters that particular argument by saying, well, what we're actually paying for in a carbon market world is not the carbon, because that doesn't make sense. As the village in Madagascar said, you're trying to sell our air. It doesn't make sense. What you're paying for is the labour, all right? And that's a place where most people feel a bit more comfortable with, where you're actually paying for somebody to do something that has value to you, all right? So worth mentioning. Now, I was asked, or the question was posed, is it a scam or is it a solution? Well, my answer to you, if you're interested in my version, it's not a scam, all right? There are scammers out there, and be careful of them, and it can be a solution. So how can it be a solution? Well, it can be a solution if we follow a set of principles, and those principles are that we need to be using it in the right way. So using it as a regenerative and restorative option and not as an avoidance option. So sometimes carbon markets can be used to avoid taking responsibility for the emissions that we do. All right, that's not what they're for. all right? That does change the nature, all right? So, but if we're using them as well as part of our best efforts to reduce our carbon emissions, well, I think there's room for that. And also, there's a need to make sure that we integrate that so that we benefit the people who depend on those systems. And there's different ways of doing that, all right? There might be ways of making sure that they receive some of the revenue, but it might be that they just get opportunities, for example, the return of the mangroves to do some fishing or harvesting of other kinds or creating tourism opportunities. There's still some barriers to implementation. I mentioned the example of the place in Queensland where a $5 million investment will get a $2 million return. It's a pilot study, so people are learning, but the rough estimate globally is that $30 US is the threshold. This is a very coarse global model, all right, but if you average out the whole world, then on average, $30 per tonne is about what you need to get a return on your investment to repair the system. Now, I've done a project for Australia where I calculated, or I was part of a team that did the calculations, and we calculated what that looked like for all of Australia. We built a model and we did that. And it turns out that for Australia, $30 doesn't give you enough return on investment to incentivise a change. It needs to be $50. At $50, we start to get some return. So we did a whole bunch of science, all right? What about Sri Lanka? I'm not sure you can read those, but that doesn't matter because you can go to this website and you can do it yourself. I just did this afternoon, after having a chat in the car with Graham earlier in the day. I thought, well, let's see if we can pull out some numbers that might be relevant for Sri Lanka. Well, the answer for Sri Lanka is that this is a global model and it won't be precisely right, but it gives you a ballpark estimate, an approximate estimate, is that there's about 7,000 hectares of areas that should be restorable back to mangroves. And if you do that, then you're getting around, what's the numbers there? So yeah, around 2 million tonnes. Okay, so that's 2 million tonnes over a period, I think it's 25 years. But what I want to highlight, if you can see the numbers on the bottom, so 2 million tonnes, let's say 2 million tonnes at $30 a tonne. All right, you can do the maths. So we're talking about if we discount the fact that we have to spend some money to get that money back, let's say it's about a $60 million return. But look at the bottom line, all right? That's the return in terms of the fish that you get. So the commercial fish, the artisanal and commercial fish benefits that you get. So that's much, much higher than the carbon. Again, this is a model. Would need to be done properly for it to have any actual operational use in Sri Lanka, but it's illuminating. So it does tend to suggest that if you're thinking about investments in Sri Lanka, then thinking beyond carbon. So thinking about those the return in terms of fisheries. So seafood companies might be very interested. Then there's biodiversity. So beyond carbon and into biodiversity, now you can already buy, sell and trade units of biodiversity. Now it becomes a bit more complicated because unlike carbon, you can't present biodiversity as a single unit. You've got all these different species and species are not equivalent. All right? But maybe it gives an opportunity to solve some of the problems that carbon has, right? If we're prepared to accept this concept of selling the right to make a claim about biodiversity, you know, after you've paid for the labour to preserve it, right? Then perhaps there's room to start rewarding stewards of the system in a way that you can't do for carbon markets at the moment. So I might just check, how's my time going? Got enough time, because I'll just do a quick 10 minutes. All right, that's enough. Thanks, Spencer. All right, so remember that carbon market diagram I put, where there's got to be an accreditation process, right? It's not like buying a fish. There's got to be some process where we have some surety in what we're doing. So that's actually why I get involved. So I'm interested in thinking about how to do that, how to do the science, how to make the observations, but then how to give a return on that to the people, all right, to Sri Lanka or to whoever. So providing the infrastructure and providing the maps, and then training. I'm really interested in the training aspect and handing that knowledge over. I won't be around forever, and it's great to see that there's so many young scientists coming through. So for a scientist, this is an exciting time, because there's so many tools that are available to us, especially if we're interested in trying to estimate biodiversity. And in terms of, if you're interested in this concept of trading biodiversity, or at least having a market for biodiversity which helps you get the investment in restoring, then these are the techniques that we need to look at, because these are what investors want. If they've got a balance sheet which says, all right, I have done this investment and received this return in terms of my biodiversity, it needs to have some assurance behind it. So that's what we want to work on. I do a lot of work on how to take observations. So we go out in the field and we measure something. We might write it down on our clipboard, or we might take a photo of it, but ultimately we want to present it in some kind of synthesized way. So we're doing a lot of artificial intelligence. The image in the middle is just what we've done. This is an artificial intelligence model which automatically classifies a photo quadrat of a seagrass. And so we're building a workflow where we load our photos up, the computer classifies them for us, and then we have it validated so that we bring in the satellite data and that we can create the maps based on that. And I showed this at the beginning, so I'll show it again, because we're also working on ways of using different technology. This is application of drone technology to do the same thing in Indonesia. Essentially, it's like with a camera, we can take a small image of a small area. With a drone, we can take images of a much larger area, and we're getting, again, building those computer machine learning models to actually do the work of classifying it for us. Again, we're trying to bring the cost down. We're trying to democratize it to make it accessible and bring the cost down, because we recognize that the investment, the upfront investment is the barrier. And we can do that for carbon, but we can also do that for beyond carbon. So this is just an example where we're using it to survey biodiversity. So we fly a drone. You can probably see the turtle in that image. The computer can also see the turtle in that image. We have image analysis algorithms now. They're getting better and better, and they can start to detect the turtles in the image. We build models. I talked about the model that we did for Australia, where we said, all right, if we did that one project in Queensland, if we did that everywhere we could do it in Australia, what would the answer be? And so we had to collect a whole bunch of information from a whole bunch of sources and build some fairly complicated models. But the answer turns out to be around about 1 million tonnes for Australia. So, and this is just one method, so bringing back the tide into systems that have been lost from agriculture. So about 1 million tonnes that we can get in Australia, but again, remember, we won't get there at the current price. It's not an incentive enough without that kind of government or philanthropic investment. And then we give that data away. So this is all free. As a QR code, you can play with this as well. If you want to do that for Sri Lanka, then have a look at and see how this works. All right, so we make that freely available. Anybody can use it. The government can use it. The private sector can use it. A carbon market operator can use it. So somebody who might be thinking about their particular region of Australia and thinking, is it going to be worthwhile in my context? They can just go and have a look at this first. All right. Right, and then that's only part of the story, because it doesn't work if it's only us doing it. If we don't hand this knowledge over, then it's not going to work so well. All right, so we put a big investment into training, and I mentioned I work, there's 23 countries around the Indian Ocean that I'm there to partner with. Well, Sri Lanka is an important one. So we've done this in Sri Lanka, and these are just images from, was it last year or the year before? We had 8 young Sri Lankans from government, from private sector, from all over come and join in our training. And they were there for several weeks, and they got full immersive training in all aspects. So that's one kind of the training we do, bringing groups of people and giving them an intensive program where we cover everything. Then the other type of training that we do is one-to-one training. And I show this photo for 2 reasons. One is because I want to demonstrate, just give you an example. So this is an 8-week one-to-one program. And Waruni, who's going to be familiar to many of you, was on that program, and this gives me an opportunity to embarrass her in front of everyone and to thank her, because Waruni has effectively been like my executive assistant for the last week, and without Waruni's help, I wouldn't have known where to be, what time to be there, or how to get there. I would have been completely lost. So this is my thank you to you, Waruni, and a demonstration to the audience that you've been to our facility and learnt a lot there. All right. But wait, there's more. So one of the reasons, in fact, the main reason that I've come to Sri Lanka this week is to gauge interest in holding our 2025 event in Sri Lanka. And I'm pleased to say that it looks very, very promising. So I'm looking at September 2025, holding the annual Blue Carbon event in Sri Lanka, somewhere in Sri Lanka. So stay tuned. That will be a large gathering of experts coming to Sri Lanka from around the Indian Ocean and elsewhere in the world. So that's my story, if you like. I promised I would cover carbon markets, and I did. I'm happy to answer questions, but really it's not, as I try to emphasize, it's not just about markets. It's this whole vista of how do we create a regenerative and restorative economy, and using all of the elements at our disposal. Carbon markets can, if we use them well, they can be a part of that, but they're not the only finance tool, and they're not the only other tool that are available. Now, before I close, there is some bonus material that has nothing to do with carbon, but is a little bit interesting and livens up the end. So, Graham and Spencer, do we have 3 minutes to show the bonus material? So what I do, one of the other things I do, so the blue carbon is most of my life. And it's, I do enjoy it, and it's pretty good. But there is a small part of my professional life which I would probably classify a little bit more like professional hobby. I get to work on turtles. I'm I'm especially interested in turtles personally, but turtles also happen to be a species that's charismatic, interests lots of people, and in an area like this where I'm showing there, it's Ningaloo, it's a World Heritage Area. There are what's considered to be a biological asset. So we go and we study these turtles there, and this is just a demonstration of how we do that. So I'm going to have a sip of water and you can watch. So I've been able to do this work for the last, well, more than 10 years. I've been very privileged to receive the funding that allows me to go and work on this World Heritage Area and try and understand the ecology of sea turtles in that place for its conservation applications. So to do that, we have to catch the turtles, and you've just seen how we do that, and then we take them on board a boat or take them to the beach, and we do a whole variety of measurements. Then we let them go. Sometimes we put tags on them and we follow them around, and sometimes we recapture those turtles. So I think that is just about it, and that probably brings me to time. So with the release, I think, of the last turtle, and then all that remains is for me to, well, thank you for bearing with me for the lecture, and again to thank the WNPS team for the opportunity to come and talk to you, and to thank everybody that's helped me in the last week.
Thank you, Matt. We have time for a few questions.
Hi, thank you for this interesting lecture. I had one question. You, in the beginning, when you were talking about the blue carbon ecosystems, you mentioned meadows, marshes, and mangroves mostly. And my question then was, where are the corals? And you did mention corals throughout the lecture, but how do they fit in the picture, and why are they left out at some moments? That was my question.
Yeah, that's a very reasonable question. The reason we don't call them blue carbon ecosystems is just the nature of corals. So corals are an animal with a calcifying skeleton. And I didn't want to get into too much science, so I didn't cover it, but since you asked, the way coral calcification works is that CO2 is actually released during the process. So it's not like photosynthesis, which uses CO2 to capture carbon and turn it into a sugar. It takes a bicarbonate product from the seawater, and then the result of that interaction is CO2 is produced. So corals, and then they're animals, so they respire. So corals aren't actually carbon sequesterers. So that's why we don't include them in our climate mitigation. But as you point out, they are important for food security, and they're important for coastal protection, very important for coastal protection, in fact.
I have a question. So, sir, you have talked about fish stocks, right? Like you talked about having sustainable fish for consumption, and do you think that Sri Lanka's fish stocks have been overfished, or is it like still sustainable, or there is no little or no?
I would like to know the answer. I don't know the answer. You know, my hunch is like so many places, fish stocks are depleted. Now, the question of overfishing is a bit more nuanced. So to be overfished, it means it's fished to the point where it's going to have trouble rebuilding. But depleted, sure. I think there's room. So it's a matter of, if we're talking about food security and feeding people, how do we ensure that we recover the depleting stocks? And to me, the answer is providing a place for the babies to grow. So the more baby fish we have, the more adult fish we have.
Hi. Thank you for the lecture. It was really interesting. What are your opinions on some of the more novel engineered blue carbon removal techniques like alkalinity enhancement or biomass sinking or things like that that are sort of cropping up in like regions across the world, but obviously still quite novel?
Yeah, thanks for the question. In some cases, it's too early to say. The US National Academy of Sciences did a review, and essentially that review was ambivalent in the sense that they said, you know, if there's potential that there's sequestration possibility from it, but the potential for perverse impacts is also large. And I think, you know, one of the lessons we should have learnt through the course of human history is that if we tinker too much with the ocean system, problems will happen at the end. So I'm not in favour of the biomass sinking, because the biomass sinking is like an engineering version of kicking the can down the road. It's essentially putting it down in the deep sea, so burying the problem, if you like, somewhere where we can't see it. That doesn't mean it's gone away. That means we've put it somewhere where we can't see it. And in theory, it should be stored for a longer period of time, but that's not forever. So I'm not massively in favour of that. Some are, and it's important to honour various perspectives and have a reasonable conversation about it. But I'm always wary of a solution which involves a bit of tinkering and changing it, because you don't know what's going to come out the other side.
Thank you.
Matt, my question is with regard to IORA. So there are two parts to it. One is, how much influence does, or how much lobbying can IORA do for future trading of carbon credits? Because back when the first edition came out, polluters could buy $100 worth of credits for, much less on the exchange. So they continue to pollute, but buy the credit less. And there was no incentivized system to change their behavior. So they continued polluting, but they just offset it with carbon credits that they bought for much less.
Yeah.
The second question is, with IORA, I suppose other than Singapore, most of them are developing countries, and I'm assuming Singapore is in IORA.
Yes.
So if you take developing countries, most of them have institutions. Some are very strong, good institutions, but some are weak and been subject to capture by interest groups. So are any of the IORA countries, or is it possible for IORA itself to push these countries to include the environment in their constitutions? Because this would allow individuals, have a direct basic right through the constitution. It's enshrined in the constitution, therefore, as an individual. So rather than relying on institutions to look after the environment, and particularly because all these Indian Ocean countries have rich biodiversity, which is really going to be the end game. It's not just about carbon credits, etc. It's going to be about biodiversity. So it's something that has to be thought about, because if you place your faith only in institutions, for example, even the accreditation will be through an institution, but then who can challenge that? So it's got to be in these developing countries, part of the reason for underdevelopment is weak institutions.
Yes, all points very well made. And your first point about effectively what we call the carbon cowboys, who were really acting in an unprincipled way. I mean, they still exist, but the development of these high integrity principles is starting to weed out that a little bit. Now, your question about IORA is a good one, and it's one that I think about a lot. IORA, as an intergovernmental organisation, it has a couple of principles that it needs to work by. One is that it operates on consensus. Okay, so getting consensus from 23 countries is no mean feat. The other is that it respects sovereignty. Okay, so the respecting sovereignty means that it can't go and tell a country to change its constitution, for example. But the working with consensus operates in a few different ways, and one of the ways that I work through IORA and with countries is through this mechanism called working groups. So it has something called a working group on the blue economy, and that working group sets a number of actions. It's got a 5-year plan, and so we work to establish what those actions should be. And there is a lot of interest, and you mentioned that most IORA countries are developing countries, and that is certainly true. And what that means is most IORA countries are interested in ways that they can improve their economy. But they're also, because they're Indian Ocean countries, they're interested in ways that they can use the ocean to improve their economy. So both of those are perfectly reasonable things to do and good things to do. So we're trying to work with them to ensure that as that happens, it's done in a way where again, you're not having these perverse impacts, because we're suggesting you can have the growth and you can have the economic benefits and you can bring people's livelihoods and reduce poverty and reduce hunger, but at the same time you can build it in a regenerative and restorative way. So that's what we're trying to do. Yeah. Yeah, it needs to be done in a very careful and considered way. And of course, it's not always, because the temptation is to rush ahead. Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, it's also, and IORA is developing MOUs and trying to be an observer. For example, the United Nations Framework on Climate Change has loss and damage as a major pillar at the moment. It's very controversial, but developing countries want to have some kind of financial mechanism in which they get not only compensated for the effects that they're feeling from climate change, which frankly they didn't cause, but also an ability to have the benefits from any climate market, climate finance that happens, which again, why wouldn't they? It's a perfectly reasonable thing to want.
I've got another question, more sort of following on from that, around institutions and around biodiversity, sort of net gain and credits and things like that. In the absence of sort of push-based regulation that's sort of pushing organizations to deliver biodiversity enhancements, like from a sort of push perspective, how do you see organizations actually delivering things when they don't have like monetary value, that pull incentives like credits aren't really delivering?
Yeah, and those are, you know, really deep issues to consider. Everybody has a role to play. So if say we think of the world in government, in private sector and in civil society, like we're here today, everyone has a different role to play. Now, governments, as I pointed out earlier, governments don't always have the money to pay for things because, and one of the reasons is for governments to earn money, they have to raise taxes. Nobody wants to pay higher taxes, right? So governments will never have enough money. But what governments do have a mandate for is regulation, okay? So, and this does speak to the previous conversation. It's about not telling other countries what to do. That's their sovereign right. We can't tell them what regulations they should, but we can provide platforms and evidence about what regulations work and what don't work. So regulations which end up having perverse effects. We can say, well, you know, look at this. You know, if you're interested in changing your regulatory system, here's some other opportunities. So, and providing those training opportunities. It's a slow burn. None of this happens overnight. But the empowering of governments, the building of strong governance and strong regulations, as well as providing opportunities for the private sector to participate in meaningful ways, and then civil society like we have here are really the catalyst for a lot of that.
Hello, can you hear me? Thank you very much. It was a great lecture, Matt. I'm a project developer in the carbon space. I've been doing this for the last 4 years. I'm also living in Sri Lanka now, so for the last 10 years. And it's not really a question, but a comment to say that Sri Lanka has an incredible wealth of natural resources, but actually it has a higher level of capacity intellectually so that Sri Lanka can become a global center in the global south for carbon projects, biodiversity projects. And it's something that I think should the government and whoever else should take advantage of, because the level of intellectual capability and education in Sri Lanka and the fact that all these scientists are available would mean that we'd give everybody in the north, the global north, where primarily carbon project developers are based, a run for their money. Just your views on that.
Yeah, and I've had a wonderful opportunity in the last 10 days that I've been in Sri Lanka, and one of the lessons that I'm going away with is the amount of talent that there is here. Talent in terms of young scientists coming through, and just general talent around, and so, you know, provided with the right opportunities, absolutely. And so that's one of the reasons I want to bring the world to Sri Lanka next year, is to provide a showcase about what's happening, and let's see where it goes from there.
We'll wrap with the last question.
Hi, carbon markets is a great market-based instrument to use, but in developing countries, there are a lot of new entrants, there are new industries and new firms coming in. So how can you set the carbon rate for it to work efficiently? And do you think carbon markets is better or carbon taxing?
Well, we're getting into some really deep stuff now. Carbon markets versus carbon tax first. The economists will say that a carbon tax is the most efficient way. But the experience in Australia is that a carbon tax is the most unpopular way. There was a government, it was a government who attempted to bring in a carbon tax in Australia, and at the election, the community promptly toppled them and threw them out because they didn't want an extra tax, right? So taxes are unpopular, even though they're effective. Carbon markets and what rate? There's a couple of ways that can go, right? One, you can let the market decide. At the moment, largely that's what happens, and at the moment, the market largely is deciding on a price which is not enough, right? So that's, and we talked about regulations just now and the role of governments. One of the things that governments can do is actually regulate on price. And in some contexts, they can also develop a floor pricing mechanism. So I mentioned the example of the study in Queensland in Australia. One of the financial innovations that the Queensland government has done is bring in a floor price guarantee. All right, so that's given some surety to the market operators, the potential project operators, that is, that if they put the upfront investment in, that at least there's a minimum price they know that they will get at the end. All right, so it's not just left to the unregulated market. There's a regulated market where there's a guaranteed minimum price that they will get. So that's another opportunity, and I think there's potentially a lot of promise in that one.
Thank you, Matt, for a wonderful insight into this whole new subject. Could we have Dr. Malik join us to give a token of appreciation to Dr. Matt? Yeah. Thank you, Matt. Thank you once again. And we invite all of you all to join for a cup of tea outside.